Usually have to hit that twice for some reason, and there it goes. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's start talking about Chapter 3. And in Chapter 3, we're going to be talking about something called process costing. Okay, we talked about job order costing in Chapter 2, and remember we tracked our cost for each job, and when we say cost, we're talking about our manufacturing cost, right? And so our product cost and our manufacturing cost, we talked about our product cost, those terms are synonymous. We talked about our direct materials, our direct labor. We also talked about manufacturing overhead. Of course, that needs to be applied, right? And we talked about applying the overhead and saw how we would handle an under or over applied overhead, right? Job order costing. After we have gathered those costs in our work in progress, we transfer them to finished goods, and then once they are sold, they go to cost of goods sold, right? Okay, so we're going to be seeing that we're going to be following a similar approach with process costing. We're still going to have our direct labor, our direct materials, our manufacturing overhead. We're going to gather those costs in work in progress. They're going to be transferred to finished goods and out to cost of goods sold. However, instead of keeping track of it by job, we're going to keep track of those same costs by department, okay, for each department. Now, we do this when we're producing homogeneous goods in which there is no difference between one item that we produce and the other, okay? And the example that I like to use, and it's a little hard for you to see from where you're sitting, is cornflakes, okay? What happens? Every box of cornflake is pretty much the same, right? There's not, oh, geez, you know, this one, the cornflakes were extra tasty in there. Every box of the cornflakes should be exactly the same. Now, somebody says, well, what about the frosted flakes? They're great, whatever. Well, if we're dealing with frosted flakes, then that's a different batch of homogeneous products, but every box of frosted flakes is the same, right? So we may keep track of our costs by the particular type of item that we're producing, but for those items we're producing, every single one of them comes out the same. So if we were dealing with cornflakes, we would have homogeneous goods. We're going to keep track of their cost by department. And in this little example, I'm going to say that we only have 2 departments. And look, you could have several departments as you pass your cost from one to the next. Usually in an academic environment like this, though, we talk about 2 departments. And so I'm going to talk about the flake department versus the cost department, right? In the flake department, what do? Well, we put a little batter, a little corn, whatever it is they put in there, a little sugar in there, mix it all up. And I used to know someone who actually worked in a factory, cereal factory, and what he told me is it's sort of one big flake when it comes out after they cook it or whatever it is they do, and then they have some machine that breaks that one big flake and turns it into a bunch of little flakes, right? So all of that happens, and we'll call that the flake department. Then all those items go down the conveyor belt into the boxing department, where somebody now has cardboard boxes and that little paper that they put inside the cereal box as they go ahead and put the cereal in the box it up, and away it goes as a finished good to be sold to whoever the probably retail outlets that buy our cereal, right? Okay, so this is describing how we will do that. And you can see that we will have our materials going into the processing departments, and then we will pass those costs from one processing department to the next, and then finally out to finished goods, and of course when they're sold, out to our cost of goods sold. So let's just go ahead, and what we're going to do in this example is see how we would track those costs through our accounting system, using T accounts and using journal entries to see how those costs flow. And you're going to see very, very similar to what we said to job process costing, but instead of the cost all going to the jobs, they're going to go from department to department. And that's going to be the only difference, okay? So we'll still have raw materials, okay? If we're thinking department A is the flake department, if we're in the flake department, the direct materials are corn, flour, whatever they put into cornflakes, water, whatever, right? Eggs, I don't know what they put in those. In department B, if that was our boxing department, now it's cardboard boxes and paper that has to be put inside the boxes, whatever, right? But each has their own direct materials that are relevant to whatever their particular department does, right? Then we go ahead and we have to apply our labor. So I don't know, in the flake department, it's a baker or cornflake maker, right? In what? In the boxing department, it's not a boxer, but it's a what? It's a guy who folds up the boxes or whatever, right? Okay, and puts the stuff in the boxes, whatever. Okay, then what? Then we have to apply our overhead. Okay, we would use our predetermined manufacturing overhead rate. We could have one that's specific to the department. We could have a company-wide overhead rate. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to use one overhead rate, and we're going to see that when we talk about activity-based costing. Remember I talked about we could have multiple drivers that we would use and multiple rates that we would use, but that's, regardless for our discussion here. However, we would apply that overhead. We apply it to each department. So now we've got all those costs gathered in the flake department, and we've got all those costs gathered in the box department. The flakes go from the flake department to the box department, don't they? Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to transfer our cost out of the flake department and into the box department, right? So you can just see all those costs that went into making that vat of flakes is now going over to the box department, and we have all the costs gathered for the box there. We're going to put the flakes into the box, right? So now we've got all the costs gathered in the boxing department, don't we, in this department B? Okay, so what's going to happen? Then, when we are completely done putting the flakes in the box, now we have gathered our cost of goods manufactured. Don't forget that term, guys. That's going to be a key term for our midterm coming up here now. Well, it's not quite that soon. It's in October, but, we always got to keep in mind that we're going to be doing our test. So don't forget our cost of goods manufactured is a key term. That's the what? The cost of things that come out of my work in progress and go into my finished goods. By the way, what do we call this total? Everything that went into work in progress, even though it doesn't show it here. Those are, remember we called those our man costs, our direct materials, our labor, and our overhead, and we maybe gathered the cost, the manufacturing cost in Department A originally, but now we've transferred them all over to Department B. So make sure you're remembering those terms, because remember, we're going to give you some questions where we're going to expect you to know what those different items are. And remember that one that would look like it was really hard? I gave you that thing with all those T accounts on it, and I said, how hard is this question? It was really easy if you knew that the credit to the work in progress and the debit to finished goods was the manufacturing cost. Okay, so definitions are important for this stuff. Okay, good. And then what? We have now finished goods, and once you have something in the finished goods inventory, you're essentially picking that up from 101A, where you sell something, it comes out of your inventory, you credit the inventory, you debit the cost of goods sold, right? So once you've gathered your cost in the finished goods, you're back to 101A, aren't you, and how you handle the inventory? Okay, good. And again, on the exams, I could be sitting there showing you T accounts with numbers in it, and I could just simply ask you, okay, what's the cost of goods sold? And you should know, well, that's got to be the credit to the finished goods, the debit to the cost of goods sold, right? Okay, so we've gathered all of those costs. That's pretty straightforward. I think that's pretty easy, right? Okay, and just added another department to what we've already learned about job order costing. Now, you come over, and forgive me for this question. I had revealed codes, and then I forgot, and I already cut and pasted. So were all those symbols supposed to mean something? I just forgot to shut off the revealed codes on this one when I cut it and pasted in here. But this is in your quiz Okay, so these are your quiz questions that I've taken the practice now of embedding them into the presentation now next to where they are relevant, right? Okay, so you have the whole quiz, but this is trying to put them next to the slides that they're relevant to. And, I'm always going to put a few more questions in the actual quiz file, so make sure that you are looking at that quiz file too, so that you're getting a chance to see everything that's going to be made available to you. And then just another thing, I'm working on putting together a set of comprehensive questions for another practice quiz. So as we get closer to our midterm, we'll have a bunch of questions that are going to be not organized by chapter, but they'll be from the first 5 chapters, but they're not going to be files, all chapter 1, all chapter 2. There'll be a mix match from the different chapters, and that'll give you an opportunity to sort of practice for your midterm, right? Okay, so that'll be up here pretty quick now that we're moving pretty closely. Our midterm is going to cover all the way up through chapter 5, right? And so we're getting pretty close now to that because we only have chapter 5 left to go. Well, no, we don't. We've got 4 and 5. Okay, so we still got a couple chapters before we get to that point. Okay, anyway, so let's just look at this question. And which of the following companies would most likely use process costing? Let's start from the bottom. Okay, and that's probably giving you a hint that the first one's the right answer since I want to start from the bottom. But let's just take a look at this. How about a law firm? Is every law case exactly the same? No, right? So you're probably going to use job order costing. The, labor of the attorney on a murder case is going to be a lot more than if it's, some sort of misdemeanor or something like that, right? So that's going to be by job, by product, whatever. Furniture manufacturer? No, right? A rocking chair is different than a lounge chair, right? Movie theater seating, that they sell now is going to be different than a, kitchen table chair, right? So, no, we're probably going to track that by product, okay? How about shipbuilder? Shipbuilder is different, right? If we're talking about a cruise ship for, I don't know, Royal Caribbean or something that's got 52 decks on it and, luxury rooms and banquet rooms and all that kind of stuff, that's going to be different than a battleship, right? So big difference there in how those costs would be gathered. So the right answer here, and I think it's kind of bolded here, is utility producing natural gas. What happens? Think about that. That natural gas is just being produced and put into tanks or whatever it is that they do, and they don't say, well, this tank of natural gas is different than that tank of natural gas. So you'd probably use process costing for something like that. Okay. Now, the best way to answer these questions, guys, is to eliminate the obvious ones that are job order costing, because sometimes I look at these and I'm like, I'm not exactly sure I know much about natural gas production, so how do I know what is, what item's going to be, that's homogeneous or not? But you can clearly rule it out by the job order costing ones, right? Have you seen that thing on YouTube of Snoop Dogg trying to figure out what's being made, and they're making hot dogs or something? Okay, and he sees all of the stuff that goes into making the hot dogs, and he says, I'm not eating hot dogs ever again, right? Check that video out on YouTube. I thought about embedding it in here, but then I figured I better not, because some of the language he uses as he sees what they're making, although you can't hear it, they bleep it out. But that's process costing, okay, when you have all this stuff that goes on and you roll out a bunch of hot dogs at the end, right? Okay, so just picture something like that where there's just a vat of something being produced, okay? All right, let's go ahead and let's try this one. Which of the following products is least likely to use process costing? And the key giveaway here is custom cabinets are obviously not process because they are custom, right? Each one is going to be unique. The cabinets that you're going to have in a 5,000 square foot house are going to be different than the cabinets you're going to have in a 1,500 square foot house, obviously, right? Okay, good. Any question on that? All right, let's go ahead and let's take a look at this one now, testing our understanding of the journal entries. And we say, which of the following journal entries would be used to record application and manufacturing overhead to work in process in a process costing system with two processing departments, Department A and Department B. I think that question takes the world record for having the word process in there in it. But what happens? Well, we're going to put our manufacturing costs in each one of those departments, aren't we? Our overhead, I should say. Well, actually, all of our manufacturing costs, our overhead, our labor, our direct materials would all go into our work in process for Department A, Department B. We would credit the manufacturing overhead, right? And we saw that in those slides that we were looking at. Okay. What about, where's the debit to manufacturing overhead? If we're crediting our manufacturing overhead here, what's the debit? This is a little bit of review from last chapter. They just showed us the credits over here, right? The debit going to the work in progress for the two departments, right? But what's the debit to work in progress? I'm not asking for a dollar amount. I'm just saying what would it encompass? Is this the applied on this side? Is the credit applied? That's the applied. So what's on the other side? Good. The actual is on the other side. So on this other side, we're going to have what? We're going to have our actual for our depreciation, our what? Utilities. Anything else? Say again. Managerial wages. When I hear that, I'm hearing you say administrative costs. No, you mean like manufacturing managers? Yeah, if they're the supervisor in the factory, the indirect labor, right, would be part of it. Yeah, so just as long as we're not mistaking that for the CEO's salary is expensed, right? Okay, but the indirect labor, indirect materials, right? I'll just put IM for that. That's all the debits that would go in there. And, of course, the corresponding credits to those debits, every debit equals a credit, right? There would be what? There would be the credit to the accumulated depreciation, credit to the utility bill payable, credits to wages payable, credit to raw materials, right? Okay, so that all works the same. The only difference is we gather the cost by department. And then what? Department 1 then transfers its work in progress out to Department 2. And assuming two departments, then we go out of Department 2, B or whatever, into our finished goods, right? Okay? Okay, good. So what most of the challenge here then for us is going to be is dealing with this concept of something called equivalent units. Equivalent units. What are equivalent units? Well, think about it. December 31st comes, and we want to prepare our financial statements, right? And we look out on the factory floor, and what are we going to have? We're going to have some stuff still sitting in raw materials. That's just like it would be for job order costing. But we're going to have some stuff that's sitting in work in progress, right? And some of that work in progress stuff is going to be, stuff that isn't quite baked yet, doesn't quite have all the labor put into it, etc. And it's going to be very difficult for us to go up to a vat of cornflake juice or batter or whatever they'd use to make those and say, okay, yeah, this is about how much labor is sitting in there and this is how much material is sitting there, because this stuff isn't a sort of a, it's a hunk of batter, isn't it? So since it's difficult for us to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, that thing looks like it's about half full, or it looks like it's about half baked. That's okay. Not that kind of half baked. The truly half baked. We still got a little bit more labor to go, etc. And what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to give ourselves credit for the amount of work that we've done up until that point, and we'll use that credit to come up with a number of whole equivalent units. if we had finished those items, okay? So we're going to have to come up with this notion of equivalent units. And so you see this very simple calculation here that if they tell us there were 10,000 units that were 70% done, we're going to give ourselves credit and say, okay, then we're done with 7,000 units. And you say, no, you're not. Those 10,000 are still in progress. That's true. But we are what? We are basically coming up with an estimate of how done we are, and we treat that as though there were 7,000 complete units, okay, in this example. Okay, so that's how we're going to treat this. And I thought I moved that slide. I didn't want that slide there anymore. I thought I moved it because the question, I wanted this question to come before that slide. So quick, hope you don't get a whiplash here as we go back to a question, and then we're going to continue on with the discussion of equivalent units here. But let's look at this question. So what happens? We have if Grayson incurred $17,400 for direct labor in the assembly department and $10,300 for direct labor in the painting department. The journal entry to record the labor used, is this correct? Is this correct? Is this true or false? Okay. Should we debit work in progress in the two departments? Yes, we should, right? Should we credit raw materials for labor? No, we shouldn't credit raw materials for labor, so this is false, isn't it? What should we be crediting here? We should be crediting, what, salaries payable or something? I don't know. Debit work in progress. Credit what? Salaries payable, or I guess if we're paying them cash, we could credit cash. But, you know, it's clearly not raw materials because we're not dealing with raw materials here. We're dealing with labor, right? Okay. All right. So now back to our regularly scheduled program, equivalent units, okay? And so let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about the two different methods used to calculate equivalent units. One is called weighted average. The other is first in, first out. So two methods, very similar to what we learned about in our accounting business 101A. We talked about weighted average. We talked about first in, first out, right? Which one do you like better, weighted average or first in, first out?
First in, first out.
Why? Weighted average is easier. Weighted average is even easier. Weighted average, we do what? We take all the costs for the period, divide it by the number of units, don't we? Right? That's the easiest. We take all the costs. We take all of our costs, our beginning inventory, plus our additional cost for the period, gives us our what? Goods available for sale. We divide that by the number of units. We get a cost per unit, don't we? That's really easy, right? Okay, that's the easiest one. And so what happens? In this class, we are only going to hold you to weighted average for the equivalent units. You are not going to have to know the first in, first out method for accounting for your equivalent units, okay? So I'm just have you aware that there's a first in, first out method. So someday when you're taking cost accounting, as you're getting once you discover your true love, which is accounting, right? You just haven't quite realized that yet. Once you discover that, then you'll be taking, your managerial accounting, and you'll be dealing with the FIFO then. So we'll save that for you for later, okay? So we're going to just focus on the weighted average method here, okay? So let's just go ahead and if you're having deja vu, so am I. So I just should have deleted that other slide is what I wanted to do. You saw this question already, equivalent unit, or this point already, equivalent units, 10,000, 70% done. That's what? That's equivalent to 7,000 units, right? So you come over, and let's just take a look at this little quick check here to see if we're understanding this. And so we have this 15,000 units started, 10,000 units are completed. If 10,000 units are completed, have we completed them? If 10,000 units are completed, have we completed 10,000 units? Yes, we have. So that's at least 10,000. Oh, darn. Can't eliminate any of the answers that way. I guess maybe you could eliminate A, because we haven't given ourselves credit for the ones that are what? Are partially done, right? And so those ones that are partially done, they tell us there's 5,000 of them and they're 30% complete. So we take those 5,000, multiply that by what? 0.3. We're going to give ourselves credit for what? As though it's a full 1,500 units that have been done now, right? And so we go ahead. Is that 11,500? Okay, I hope that's the answer. Oh boy. Okay. Okay, so it's 11,500. We give ourselves credit for what we finished, and then we take a percentage for those that are still in progress, or we give ourselves credit on a whole basis using the percent complete that we think they are. Do we know if they're exactly 30% complete or not? Okay, no, but we're going to use that estimate, aren't we? Okay, we might use engineering estimates, etc., to help us figure out how far along we are. I don't know, maybe, you know, the chef comes in and sticks his arm halfway into the vat and says, oh yeah, it's below my elbow, that's 30%. Whatever it is that they're going to do to figure this out. Okay? All right, so you come over and be careful, guys, if you're getting sleepy. You know, maybe you were celebrating a little too long with the Raiders yesterday or whatever it is, okay? If you're getting a little sleepy, now would be a good time to come back to me, because in a minute we're going to start getting into some of the calculations here for these equivalent units, and all of a sudden you're going to look up and say, when did John start speaking Spanish? Okay, so hang in there now. Don't sleep on me, okay? All right, so come over. And let's take a look. Yeah, okay, got it. Two methods, okay? And let's just look at that weighted average method here now in more detail, okay? So weighted average, basically what we're going to do is take all of our costs for the period and come up with a cost per unit. And when we come up with that cost per unit, the way we're going to come up with that cost per unit is to take all of our costs for the period and divide that by the equivalent units that were produced for the period. Once we know what that cost per unit is, we will know what we should, how we should cost the items that are being transferred out of one department into another, or out of our last processing department into what? Into our finished goods. Okay, that's where we're going with this. So let's just go ahead, and this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, guys, and you're going to have to probably look at this slide a couple times to make sure that you're comfortable with some of the terms that I've highlighted here. Okay, and when you look at problems, they will tell you the beginning inventory that was in the work in progress, and they tell you in terms of units here, 300. Some problems will tell you the units that were completed and transferred out, and they'll just come right out and tell you the units that were completed and transferred out for the period, and they'll just tell you that. Is that what this problem did? This problem told me 5,400 for that. That's that blue part. And then all I'll have to do is I'll say, okay, if 5,400 units were completed and transferred out, and I want to figure out what the equivalent units were that were completed, I'll simply take that number and add what? Add the equivalent units of the ending inventory. For example, I take the 5,400, and if we're talking about our materials, I would take what? I would take 0.6 of 900. That's what? 54 or something like that, and I would add that to the 5,400, and that's how I will calculate, not 54, but 540. I would go ahead and I would take that and add that to the 540 units to come up with my equivalent units. If they just give me that number, right? That's the kinder, gentler problem where we just come out and we say, here you go, here's the units that were completed and transferred out. Okay, we're going to see how those calculations will look in a minute, because in this example, they're going to pivot off that number because it was given. With me so far? Okay, now what happens? Sometimes the problem is mean, and they don't give you that 5,400. They make you figure it out. Okay, and this yellow highlighting is where I've shown you how to figure that out. So what happens? They'll tell us units started into production were 6,000. If the units were started into production and then we have 900 units that are still in progress, are those units that we start in production done yet? Are those units done yet? If they're saying they're still in ending work in progress, they're not done yet, right? So that highlighting in yellow, I'm saying, okay, 5,100 units were started and completed, weren't they? Okay, 5,100 units were started and completed. And then what? And then the assumption here is that we finished those units that were in beginning work in progress. And that makes sense, right? You're not going to start a bunch of new, cornflakes and not finish the ones that you already had started. So then you go ahead and you add in the beginning inventory, and that gives me the same number here, this 5,400, doesn't it? Okay. The 6,000 and the 900 are given to you in these entertaining questions that we're going to be looking at a little bit later. So, the company would know how many units they had started, and the company would know what the units were that were in beginning inventory and what the units were that in ending inventory, right? And so then they would go ahead and be able to calculate the units that were completed and transferred out. And I'm just saying that in some problems, they'll just tell you, units completed and transferred out, that's going to be the easy question because when they ask me equivalent units, because I simply have to add the equivalent units for the ending inventory to the units that were completed and transferred out to figure out on an equivalent unit basis how many units got transferred out. Sometimes they'll leave that number out. They won't give you that 5,400, and then you're going to have to calculate it. Okay, but so that's the meaner problem. That's not the as easy problem. Okay, but we're going to see in practice with both varieties here with these questions towards the end of this section of the presentation. Okay, that I've already embedded in here. So let's just go ahead. And let's take a look, though, just at this question. So when they tell this thing where they're telling me the units that were transferred out, right? So that's pretty easy. I start with that. I know those units got transferred out of this department, don't I? I know those units got transferred out of this department, so I start with that 5,400. When you get that question, you could say, thank the Lord I got that question. This is an easy one, 5,400, right? I know those got transferred out. And then you're going to go ahead and figure out the equivalent units. Now, when you figure out your equivalent units, they make us do it separately for materials versus conversion. Remember, conversion costs are what? Direct labor and what? No. Well, kind of in a way, in a backhanded way, I guess, or a back, I don't know what word I should use in a small way. It's the indirect labor, somebody said, because manufacturing overhead applied does include a component for my indirect labor, doesn't it? But my conversion costs are what? My direct labor and my manufacturing overhead. Do you think it's possible that you'll have a different percent complete for materials versus your conversion cost? Makes sense, because usually, unless it's some sort of weird process, and I can't think of one that you'd have the labor first and then you'd put the materials. Be kind of weird, right? That people would be all there doing all kinds of work with nothing in front of them, and then later the materials come. Okay, so what happens? Usually we have this situation where the materials are there and we start to apply the overhead and the labor to it, right? So often the material part is going to be ahead of the labor part, isn't it? We'll have a larger percentage done for our materials versus our labor. Okay, so let's just go ahead and see if that's what happened here. And sure enough, they give me what? They tell me that I have 900 units that are 60% done as to materials. I go ahead and I give myself credit for equivalent units of 540. You see how easy that was? You just take the number of units that were completed and transferred out. You know those are done, right? And then what? And then you go ahead and you add in the percentage of the equivalent units. The only wrinkle is sometimes they don't tell me the units that are completed and transferred out, and I have to calculate that. But in this problem, they just gave it to me, so I took that 5,400. I added equivalent units for my material. I do the equivalent units for my conversion cost, my labor, and my overhead, and that's 30%, and that's typically the case in these questions, in which you'll see that the materials are further along than the conversion cost, our labor, and our overhead. And there's our equivalent units. Can you handle that? How easy is that? Okay. Okay, good. Now you come over, and they tell us that the equivalent units of production always equals units completed and transferred out plus the what? Plus the equivalent units that are in ending inventory. Isn't that what we just did? Okay. Now they say it always equals that, and they act as though the tooth fairy is going to always come down and hand you units completed and transferred out. Sometimes a fair number of the questions do that, but some of them are going to make you calculate that. Okay. Okay. So we have the units completed and transferred out now. The equivalent units now, don't we? Okay. So we have that number, but we're going to have to. In accounting, we need dollar amounts, and we need dollar amounts for what reason? Why do we want dollar amounts? Why do we care about dollar amounts in accounting? Huh? So we have the monetary unit assumption. The amounts that we put in the financial statements aren't units. It's going to be what? Dollars. And how do we get numbers into the financial statements? How do we end up with numbers in our financial statements? Accountants do it with journal entries. We need numbers to be able to make journal entries that will do what? Will credit the work in process in Department 1, debit the work in process in Department 2, then what? Credit the work in process in Department 2, debit the finished goods inventory, right? Okay, so we need numbers so we can make those journal entries so we can transfer these costs from department to department off of the balance sheet into our income statement, right, and our cost of goods sold. So let's just go ahead and let's see then how we will come up with a cost per unit. And once we come up with that cost per unit using our equivalent units, we will be able to go ahead and make our journal entries for transferring our costs from department to department and then to finished goods. So let's just go ahead, and you can see now they're giving us dollars, and they're giving us the dollars for both my materials and my conversion costs for the beginning work in progress, and they're doing it for what? The units added to production for the period, aren't they? So they've given me the cost both for what was in beginning work in progress and what got added to work in progress for the period, right? Okay. Now, what happens? They will always give you this percentage as to what percent. Hang on. Okay. They will always give you this percentage as to how far along we were, and yeah, that's what I thought. I got to fix the pen back. It's so irritating. I don't know why it has to do that. Okay, but anyway, they will always give you what? They will always give you the percentage as to how far along our beginning inventory was. They'll always give you that percentage. Do you guys ever heard of Clint Eastwood? You ever heard of Dirty Harry? There's this guy, Clint Eastwood played like this really rogue police officer, right? And he has this huge gun. It's called a Magnum 44 or something like that. And he always tells people, he says, if this handgun could blow your head clean off, he tells them, right? And that's how he gets everybody to behave, okay? So what I'm going to tell you right now is stay away from that 20%. It could blow your head clean off, and that you'll miss the problem if you mess with that. So step away from that percentage. It's like, think of it as a shark. What do you do when you see a shark? You leave it alone, right? Okay. The best way to avoid shark attack is not go in the water, right? Okay. But if you see a shark, unless it's Sharknado or something, but if you see a shark, leave it alone. It won't bother you, right? Okay. So what happens? Maybe it won't bother you. So leave this alone. Don't touch that, okay? When we went and considered our beginning inventory, we acted as though we did all the work for those units this period, didn't we? We stuck the whole 300 in there, right? So you're not going to sit there and say, okay, well, only this portion of the costs are relevant to my beginning inventory. You're going to throw all of the costs that were in the inventory in the numerator for this calculation we're going to do to come up with our equivalent unit cost per unit, because you included all those inventory items in the denominator, didn't you? Okay, so what are you going to do? You're going to ignore those percentages and throw all those costs in there. Remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with an average for our equivalent units for the period. We're in the weighted average method, aren't we? Okay, good. So you go ahead, you pick up all those costs. You'll pick up all the cost of my cost added for this period. I'm going to divide that by the equivalent units, and that's going to give me my cost per unit, and that's how I'm going to calculate what I need to transfer out of my work in progress and into my finished goods, or from one department to the other. Just depends on what department we're in. So let's just go ahead and let's take a look at that calculation. We'll have the equivalent units, which we've already calculated, and then we're going to take the total cost. Don't take those percentages. The total cost that is in my work in process inventory and the total of all the costs that were added for the period. I'll divide that by my equivalent units, which we've already calculated in the previous slides. Okay, so you come over, and that's exactly what they do. They pick up all of those costs that were in the beginning inventory. The what? $6,199 for the materials, the $3,920 for the conversion cost, right? Do you want me to go back to that slide to show that those are the same numbers? Those are the same numbers that were there, right? I told you stay away from those percentages, but we picked up all the dollars, didn't we? Are those same numbers? Okay, we picked up all of those dollars, and then we're going to pick up the cost, all the costs that were added for the period, and that was those same numbers for materials for our conversion costs, right? Same numbers there, right? Just picked them up, brought them over. Okay, and then we just went ahead and we divide them by the equivalent units, which we calculated by taking the units completed and transferred plus our percentage complete times the units in ending inventory to come up with our equivalent unit calculation, right? And when we do that, we come up with an equivalent unit cost per equivalent unit, I should say, for my materials, and one for conversion. So we're going to have to come up with two separate unit costs, one for materials, one for conversion, because those two are different percentages done along the way, aren't they? Okay, but that gives me my weighted average cost. They go ahead in this example here and add those two together to give you an overall cost per equivalent unit. In most of the problems that we're going to look at here, I'm going to ask you for those separately. So I'm not going to ask you to go ahead and do a calculation of those separately. I'll ask you to do it separately. I'm not going to ask you to combine it, but they did give us that number. But I'm not going to ask you to do that. It's going to be separate. Okay. With me so far? Questions so far? Came up with what? Equivalent units, right? That was sort of step one. How do we come up with equivalent units? We took the cost of the units completed and transferred out. In some of the easier problems, it'll be given to us. In other ones, we'll have to calculate it, right? Okay, then what? To get the equivalent units, we simply took the units completed and transferred out, and we added on the percentage to come up with the equivalent units that were completed for our ending inventory. Added those two numbers together. That gave us our equivalent units of production, and we did it separately for materials and conversion, right? Then what? Then we gathered all the costs, all those that were in work in progress at the beginning of the period, and all of those costs that we added to work in progress for the period, our manufacturing costs for the period, right? Took all of those, and then what? In our numerator, divided it by our equivalent units in the denominator to come up with equivalent cost per unit. Okay? Now that we have that equivalent cost per unit, now we can go ahead and figure out the cost of our ending inventory and the cost of our work in progress. Okay, so for our ending inventory, since we figured out our cost per unit, and we said that we had an equivalent units of 540 for our materials, 270 for our labor. Remember the 540? Remember I said, what's that, 54 or something? It's 900 times 0.6 was what? 540, right? That's my equivalent units for my material, whatever it was, 30%, I guess. For my conversion cost times the 900 gave me the 270, right? And I just multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit that I just calculated, going through those steps that we talked about, and that gives me the value of my ending inventory. Now I go ahead and I figure out the cost of the items that were completed and transferred out. That's 194. Now I know what to credit in my work in progress and debit in my finished goods, assuming this was the last processing department, right? Okay, now I know what to do with that. So I have these numbers here, and they are going to direct me to prepare this sheet to make sure that everything reconciles. Okay, they're going to tell me to do this to make sure that everything reconciles. I'm going to show you a different way. Okay, I'm going to show you a different way that I would do this. Okay, so let's just think about this for a minute. This is my work in process account, isn't it? Is this my work in process account? T account? Work in progress? Okay. And they told me that I had a beginning balance in here. I'm just going to put a little column over here for my balance. They're telling me that the beginning balance is what? And I'm just going to do the total here. I'm not going to do it by labor versus 10,039. Is that the balance that's in there? 10,039, isn't it? Okay. And then they tell me that I go ahead and for the period I've added what? 199,751. Did I pick up the right number there? Okay. So what's happening? I've added those costs for the period, and right now I have stuck in there then, just doing the math, and you can see it, this 209,790. Can I squeeze it in? What do you think? 209,790. Isn't that the total in there now? Okay, so I've got that stuck in my work in progress, don't I? And I need to get it out of work in progress, and if this is the last processing department, I want it to go into my finished goods, I guess. Well, how am I going to do that? Well, I have to credit it for the cost of the items that were what? That were transferred out for the period, and I've calculated that by taking the what? Number of equivalent units, those units that I'm giving myself credit for having completed, and multiplying that times my cost per equivalent unit, right? Isn't that how I came up with that 194,400? Right? Just quickly going back and looking at the previous slide. That's where I came up with that 194,400 right there was done by taking the 5,400 units that I transferred out. I had to do it separately for materials and conversion, but that gave me that 194,400 that I need to transfer out to, if this was my last processing department, out of finished goods and into, out of work in progress and into finished goods, right? Okay, so I come over and I take a look, and let's just do that. Let's credit this for 194,400, and I'm going to debit finished goods for 194,400, right? And when I do, what's the balance sitting here in my Finished goods. Huh? On what planet? What? Oh, I'm sorry. In finished goods. Sorry. What's the balance in my work in progress? Sorry. What's the balance in my work in progress? Good. 15,000. Saying on what planet? Because I'm like, it would be way off from that. Okay, sorry. On the planet Earth, John, where are you? Okay, so it's what? 15,390 is the balance that's left if you do the journal entry for the, analyze the T account here for the debits and credits, right? So, don't you love accounting? Accounting gives you this answer for free, the ending inventory, doesn't it? If you can figure out the cost of what gets transferred out, the accounting gives you the answer for free. And that's all we were trying to figure out with this whole thing was what is the cost of the items that are transferred out, right? Using it on an equivalent unit basis anyway. Okay, and so we would have seen the answer after we made the journal entry. So you say, well, why'd you bother then even calculating the cost of the ending inventory just to make sure that we didn't mess up? This is a check figure, isn't it, for us? It's more of a check figure than anything. You don't really need to multiply the equivalent units in ending inventory times your cost per equivalent unit to get the answer here, but we do that just to make sure that our logic flowed through and we properly accounted for all our costs. That's really the point of that ending inventory calculation. Okay? Question? All right, no questions. Let's look at some quiz questions then. Okay, let's take a look at these. And this first one here is asking me what is the amount for the units that were completed and transferred out. Okay, I just want to take a look at my couple of notes here. Okay. What is the equivalent units, I should say, equivalent units of production. Okay, that's what they're asking me for. What is equivalent units of production for? And as I said, usually we'll just ask you for them separately in a problem. I don't think there's any that we're going to give you. There's going to be two columns, one for materials, one for conversion costs. But I've seen a lot of problems like that where they ask you for each of them. Okay, but for this one, they're just asking me conversion cost, and they tell me that they use the weighted average method, and the assembly department started the month with 9,000 units that were in beginning inventory, and they tell us that the work in process was 70% complete with respect to construction costs. An additional 90,000 units were transferred in from the prior department during the month to begin processing in the assembly department, and during the month 87 units were completed. Thank you, God. If they tell me that, I know I just pick up what? I pick up that 87,000 units. They told me that that's what was completed, didn't they? So I just grab that number. Okay. Then what? Then they go on to tell me that there were 12,000 units in ending inventory. There were what? 20% complete. So I take that 12,000 times the 20%. Is that an easy question? Okay. Question? It's so easy you're stunned, right? Okay. Question? All right, let's go ahead and let's try this one now. Okay, and so here they go ahead and they tell me that we have this number of units here in this situation, and they want to know what is the equivalent units for my conversion cost. Do you see a number here that you want to pick up right away? I should have somebody come up and do this one for me. Do you see a number that you want to pick up right away? Yes, sir. Beautiful. The 37,100, I'm picking that up right out of the gate because I know that those units were completed and transferred out, right? So all those units were done? Good. So I go ahead and I pick that up. I guess it's me. I don't know. So that's what, 37,100? Good. Now what do you want me to do? 96. 9,600 times the 0.8. Good. And that comes to what? 7,680. I add those two together, and I get 44,780. Is that the answer? Beautiful. Well, that one's easy too, right? So what would I do if they didn't give me that 37,100? Could I still get it? They didn't give me the 37,100. Could I still get that? Well, the way I would do it is I would pick up the units that were transferred in from the prior department. That's basically the new costs that were added for the period. Instead of us saying, okay, it's direct labor, direct materials, it's manufacturing overhead, we're just saying all the costs that got transferred in from the previous department is going to be what? Is going to be like our manufacturing cost for Department 2. So all of that came in. So that's what? That's all the costs that got added for the period, 40,100. Then what happens? Then I look at that and I say, well, look, are those 9,600 units done? They are? Then why are they in ending work in progress? There's amounts in the ending work in progress. By definition, they are not done. They're in progress, aren't they? Okay, so there's 9,600 that I know I didn't finish those, right? So for all the costs that I added for the period, there was 9,600 units that are not done, right? So the way I do it, I would back that out. That gives me now what, 30,500? Those are the units. That's going to be entertaining on the recording. Those are the units that are what? Those were the units that were started and completed, weren't they? They were started and completed, and then I'm going to give myself credit for having done all the work on the beginning inventory this period, right? And when I do that, I go ahead then and I add in the beginning inventory. Beginning inventory was what? 6,600. Okay, 6,600. Do I get the same number? 37,100 were the units completed and transferred out, right? Because I did what? I completed the work on those beginning inventory ones, and I completed the work on the ones that I had started that aren't still in progress and ending inventory, right? So I get that same number, and then I would go ahead and add then the what? The equivalent units for my ending inventory, right? To get the answer to this question. Okay, that's if they don't give me the units completed and transferred out. Here they did.
So what is the same? Why don't we use that?
This one? Why don't we use it? Because that's not what we do when we use the weighted average method. Weighted average method says we're going to take all the costs that were incurred, both in that were gathered, I should say, both in the beginning inventory, plus the costs that were added for the period, and that's going to be how we're going to calculate our weighted average. If it's FIFO, you basically only include the cost that you have added for the period to come up with your calculation for the amount transferred out and work in your ending inventory. Okay, and you have a little bit of a different approach to that, but we're not going to do FIFO in this class. Okay, so we're just trying to average the cost of all the costs that we have gathered in there, the beginning plus the amount added for the period. Okay. Okay, good. So you come over and you take a look at there's the answer. So they give you the answer. I wrote it up for you, but that's the same thing we did in our calculation. Okay, let's look at this one. Let's take a look at this one. And they say, what is the equivalent unit for my direct materials? And they tell me that the materials are 80% done. Okay, and so they tell me the units that were completed and transferred out are what? 4,000. This is the easy version, isn't it? So I know I have to pick up that 4,000. And then what? Then I'm going to take the 3,000 units that were in my ending work in progress, and I'm going to apply the 80% to that, and that gives me my equivalent units. And so the answer here is this 6,400. Is that easy? Right? What happens if they don't tell me the units that were completed and transferred out? What if they don't tell me the units that were completed and transferred out? Well, I'll pick up what? Units started, 7,000, and then I'm going to do what? I'm going to see that there's 3,000 units that are sitting there in my ending inventory, right? Are the items in my ending inventory done yet? Oops. Are the items in my ending inventory done? No. If they're in the ending work in progress, they're not done yet, right? So I go ahead and I'm going to subtract that out. So that's what, 3,000? Okay. Take those out. That gives me 4,000 units that were started and completed, right? And how much work did I do on the, did I give myself credit for the beginning inventory? Nothing. There was nothing in beginning inventory, so I have no credit for that, right? There was nothing in beginning inventory, but it still gave me the same answer, didn't it? Using that process. Okay, that's the way I like to do these, guys. If the problem doesn't give it to me, I just go about it that way. You may think about it a little bit differently after you look at this for a while. I like to look at it that way. That's just the way I feel it. Okay, what got added for the period? I'm going to do what? I'm going to subtract out what's not done yet. That gives me the units started and completed. And then I go ahead and I give myself credit for the entire beginning inventory. Add that back in. Okay? Okay, good. Come over and let's take a look at the next question. We're moving pretty quickly here. I'm going to run out of material here in a minute. And I don't mean direct materials. Material for us to talk about here. Sure you guys don't have any questions? I was sort of anticipating a little bit more of a process here for you to understand it. You're kind of like soaking it up like a sponge here on me. Okay. All right. No question. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this one. And we have this Larner Corporation. And Larner Corporation is, and this problem is a little more in depth, okay? And we're going to actually take this question beyond where even the question goes, okay? Because we're going to have to sit here and come up now with the cost per equivalent unit. So those first couple ones, we're just focusing on the equivalent unit, right? Now we've got to bring in and capture the appropriate cost to come up with the cost per equivalent unit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually see how we will transfer the cost out of this department, and I'm going to assume this is the final processing department into finished goods, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and let's take a look and see what we have here. And I'm going to take a look, and they give me information here, and we want the cost per equivalent unit for what? My conversion cost, right? And I take a look, and they tell me that we're having beginning work in progress, 24,000. Units started into production, 86,000. Ending work in progress, 19,000. Did they give me the units started and completed? Huh? Where? They did not give it to me. This is one of those harder ones where I got to figure it out, didn't they? They gave me the unit started, but they don't tell me the unit's completed. So what do? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the units that were what? That were started for the period, which is 86,000. I'm going to subtract off what? The units that are in ending inventory, 19,000. That gives me now what? That gives me the units that were started and completed this period of 67,000. And then I'm going to give myself credit for having completed the entire beginning inventory of this period, right? Don't worry about what percentage says here. We're going to say that we did what? Stay away from that, right? We're going to go ahead and add that 24,000, right? And so now the units completed and transferred out. The units completed and transferred out, if I'm doing my math right, are 91,000. Okay, so I had to work to get to that easy point in those other questions that were easier where they just gave me that number. I had to work to get to that 91,000 that was completed and transferred out. Now I want to get my equivalent units because I have to give myself credit for the items in ending inventory that aren't quite done yet, right? So I go ahead and I take that 91,000. Take that 91,000 and I'm going to add to it now my equivalent units. How many items do I have in ending work in progress? 19,000. And they tell us that those are what percent complete? Those are 20% complete. Good. And so I take that 19,000 times the 20%. What's that? 3,800? Am I doing my math right? That's 3,800. I add that, and I have my equivalent units now of 94,800, right? With me so far? Okay. Now, in those other problems, this was victory. Now, here we've got another round to go now to get the cost per equivalent unit. Okay. So what do? We pick up what? Both the cost of the items that were in beginning inventory and the cost of the items that were added for the period, don't we? Right? We pick up all the costs. And when we do, we take that 68,064 and we add the 5,853,24. And when we add those two numbers together, we get 653,388. Right? What do you want me to do with that number? Good. Divide it by the equivalent units. Excellent, guys. You guys are on fire today. Would you eat your Wheaties this morning? Or you ate your cornflakes, right? Okay, so it happens. 653,388 divided by the 94,800 equivalent units gives me a cost per equivalent unit of 6.8922784. Is that what they call an irrational number? Right? But there it is. But the what? Clearly the right answer is the 6892. Right? With me so far? I say if I'm an accountant. I am one. Sometimes it's even hard for me to believe. How did I end up being an accountant? God, what happened? Okay, no, just kidding. Okay, so what happens? You sit here and you have this number here, this 6.8922784, and I want to make a journal entry with this number, don't I? Accountants do it with journal entries. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put myself a T account over here, work in progress. And I always seem to end up in a corner when I'm trying to do my T accounts. My work in progress. And do I know what the beginning balance of work in progress was? Do I know what the beginning balance of work in progress was? They told me it was what? 68,064, right? Okay, cool. I got that. 68,064. And then they told me that I added what in cost for the period? 585, 324. And when I add those in, I come to that total now, which I've already calculated to be 653, 388. With me so far? Okay. Now I want to transfer some of these costs out of work in progress, and I'm going to presume that this is the last processing department, so it's going to go to my buddy finished goods over here. So I'm just going to tee up finished goods over here. Okay, and how will I calculate that? Well, I'm going to take how many units did I assume were transferred out? How many items did I give myself credit for having completed this period and were transferred out? Huh? The 94,800 is what I'm assuming I've transferred out, right? And I go ahead and I take that and I multiply that times, it's not 94,800. That's my equivalent units, right? I don't pick up that number. How many items did I say I transferred out? Sorry. How many items did I say I transferred out? 91,000, right? So I say that I transferred out 91,000. So I go ahead and I take that 91,000. Wait a minute. One second, guys. And so I go ahead and I take what 6.922784, and I'm going to multiply that not by the 94,000, but by what? The 91,000. And so I take that 91,000 times, where do I want to write this? I'll do it up here. 91,000 times 6.8922784, and that gives me what? 627,197, and I got 33 cents. Okay, so that's the cost of the items that were completed and transferred out for the period, right? So I go ahead and I subtract those out. 627, now I'll never fit that in there. 627, 197, and 33 cents. Okay, and the balance now becomes what? Becomes the ending balance in my work in progress, which is going to be, in this example, 26,190. 26, 26,190. Huh? I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. 26,001. Right. 627, 197.33, right? Off of the 653, that's going to give me now this 26,190, right? Does someone want to check my math, or am I not doing my math here? 191.67. I got 190.67, but if you want to make it 191.67. Right? Guys, this is debits and credits right here. All I did was I had a beginning balance of 68,064. I added 585,329. I got 653,388, right? Right? Okay. Then I simply went ahead and I now figured out the cost of the items that I transferred out, which is 627,197.33. I'm left with a balance of, I didn't get 26,191.67. I got 26,190.67. So we got a difference of $1. Okay, so it's 26,190. Okay, 26,190. Right? Okay, that's what's left in my ending work in progress. And just to check that, I'm going to take the 6.89222784 times what? Times the number of equivalent units that are left in my ending inventory, which is what? 3,800. Okay, and if you take that 6.89222784 times the 3,800 equivalent units that are left in my ending inventory, I end up with 26,190.657. So I owe somebody, 2 cents or something. Okay. So again, that last step that I just did to calculate the cost of the ending inventory, which we were doing in the example when we went in the slides, we do that just to check to make sure we didn't drop some number somewhere, right? And the reason I was going through all that trouble is that big long number was messing me up. You have to use that irrational number because there's so many units, 91,000 units, that you get a rounding error that starts to confuse you, right? If you don't use that irrational number that's sitting in your calculator. Okay, so again, this one we got the answer 6.892, but I kept going with this because I wanted to have you see, well, we just don't end with that number. We're going to use that number to make a journal entry, right? And we take the number of units that we transferred out, that we completed and transferred out, 91,000, times that what? Times that 6.89222784. We multiplied that times the 91,000 up there near the top. That gave me the cost of the units that I'm saying I've transferred out. And then I went ahead and credited that. And what did I debit? What did I debit when I credited my work in progress for that amount? What did I debit when I credited my work in progress for that amount? My finished goods, good. So that's going to be 627. Well, I'm not going to write it again. We credit the finished goods for that. We debit the finished goods for that amount, right? Okay. And then what? And then we go ahead and we're left with the ending inventory. That's what we're saying, the equivalent units, the 3,800 equivalent units that are sitting in ending inventory, that's their value. How do we check that? Take the 3,800 equivalent units times that big, long, irrational number, and that gives us the verification of the ending inventory. Okay, so that's somewhat of a comprehensive problem there if you add in those last couple of steps where I started asking the cost of the units, or if I were to ask the cost of the units that were transferred out, if I were to talk about the value of the ending inventory, you'd have to keep going with this. This question was also somewhat comprehensive in that you had to figure out the units that had been completed and transferred out for the period to be able to calculate your equivalent unit cost per unit, right? Okay, question? Okay, good. Let's go ahead then and let's take a look at this question. Actually, who wants to do this one? No, not this one. I'll have you do the next one. Somebody get ready to do the next one. Okay, but let's look at this one together. Because this one is a little bit unique in that you're not able to use the approach that we've talked about as easily here, and you have to kind of think about it a little bit differently. Okay, so in this problem, they tell us that at the beginning of the recent period, there were 900 units of product in a department, 35% completed. These units were finished, and an additional 5,000 units were started and completed during the period. 800 units were still in progress. So the way this question is written, you're going to have to sit there and say, okay, I had now these units sitting here that were in the beginning inventory of 900, and they tell me that they completed those, and then they also give me the number of units that were started and completed for the period. So I actually have to add those two together, don't I? So this one, you couldn't use the typical pattern of saying, well, I'm going to take my beginning inventory minus my items that were my units started for the period minus my ending inventory, and then add back in the beginning inventory units, because they tell me 5,000 units were started and completed. They're giving me that, right? And then they separate out the discussion of the 900 units that were sitting there and in beginning inventory, and they tell me I finished this period. So I get that 5,900, and then once I get that, it's pretty easy. It's just like we saw before to go ahead and bring in the number of equivalent units. Okay, so this question you have to read a little bit differently in that they tell me 900 units of product were there at the beginning of the period. They were finished, and then an additional 5,000 units were started and completed. So that word additional is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, isn't it? If they just said the unit started and completed, then we would have known that that included the beginning inventory. But because they said an additional, you had to add those two together to get the total units that were started and completed for the period. And once you got to that, then you could just go ahead and do your equivalent unit calculation the way we did. Okay, so that problem was a little bit different. Okay, good. So Steve, why don't you come up and do this one? You can do student on the board. So what do we got here? We've got this information that they had beginning inventory 40% complete, and they had ending work in progress for the period is 400, and then the total units started during the year here is 3,200. How do you want to work that one?
So you first do the 3,200 units started,
Okay, 3,200 units started during the year.
and then you subtract the ending.
Going to subtract out the ending inventory of 400 units because those weren't done yet, right? Good. That gives you 2,800. Okay, nice. And then what do you want to do?
And then you want to add 200 the beginning balance.
Going to go ahead and
Beginning balance.
Add the beginning balance back, right? Good, because what? Because we also finished those this period, didn't we? Okay, I thought you were sleeping. Okay. And now you want to do what?
And then we're going to add the 400 times the 80%.
Yeah, the equivalent units for the ending inventory. Nice job.
Can we finish it?
Yeah, go for it, man. You're this far, you did this much. What is he gonna? He just wants to drop the pen. I'm done, right? Okay.
320.
320. Yeah, it's what? 400 times 80% is 320. And so that comes to 3,320, which is the answer here. Nice. Good job. I guess you listen better with your eyes closed. Okay, so 3,320. Okay, good. Good job. Okay, any question on that one? Okay, so that was pretty much that process that we talked about where they don't tell me the unit's completed and transferred out. I have to back into it, right? Right? Okay. Okay, good. Now, the solution that they give you, that I gave you, that I stuck in the solution on the next slide, and if this works better for you guys, yes, sir.
On the first thing, it says beginning inventory 40% complete and 1,100. Would that 1,100 be for the prior period?
Yes, the 40% complete, and we incurred costs in the prior period of 1,100. Okay, but be careful. We know we're going to stay away from that 40%, right? Okay, that's the shark that we're going to avoid. But what? The 1,100, we will pick that cost up when we calculate our cost per equivalent unit, right? That's the beginning balance in the work in progress. But yes, those costs were the beginning balance. They were accumulated in the prior period, but we're giving ourselves credit for having done all the work on the beginning inventory, what? This period, right? And so we include those costs in. Okay? Okay. Sure.
And maybe I'm reading the question wrong. Why did you use the 40%, not the 80%?
Well, I didn't use the 40% because this is the weighted average method. And under the weighted average method, I give myself credit for having done all that work on those units, no matter how far. Even if they were 90% done at the beginning of the period, I give myself credit for having done all of that work this period. So I ignore that 40%. I assume I did 100% of that work this period. If this was the FIFO method, we'd only give ourselves credit for the work that we've done this period, so we would actually use that percentage. If they were 40% done when the period started, we would say, okay, we only produced then 60% of that total this period, and under that scenario, we only pick up the cost for the period to calculate our equivalent units. So they're sort of like mirror images of each other. Okay, but we're not going to do FIFO here. We're going to do weighted average. We're averaging the cost of everything over the number of units, including the beginning inventory. And that's what weighted average does in financial accounting too. You take what? Your beginning inventory plus your purchases for the period gives your goods available for sale. You divide that by the number of units that you have for the period that you had available for the period. That gives you your weighted average cost per unit, and you use that in financial. We're dealing with retail, so we use that to calculate our cost of goods sold, right? Okay. Okay, now this one, they took a little different approach, and you might like this better. I'm just going to show it to you. My brain doesn't process it this way, but if you want to do it this way, you could say beginning work in progress plus the number of units started minus the what? Ending work in progress means these are the units we transferred plus what? Plus now the equivalent units. Okay, that might be a little more straightforward for some people. I have a little bit of a different, weirder way of looking at it. When I talk to myself about these, I say, no, I have what? I have the units that I started for the period. The ones that are still in ending inventory aren't done yet, so I'm going to subtract those off, and then I'm going to give myself credit for everything that I did this period. Just a different way to talk yourself through it. But if this works for you, you could do this too, right? Okay? Okay, good. come over and let's take a look at this question. And the most important part of this question is they tell me that the beginning inventory was 100% complete with respect to materials, okay? And since this question was asking me to compute the direct materials cost per equivalent unit, notice that I went ahead and to figure out the units transferred, I went ahead and said what? 100% of those. They told me that the units transferred somewhere in here is 135,000, okay? Where'd they get that 135,000 becomes a question with this one. 135,000 is the what? The 25,000 that were in process plus the 110,000 units that were started and completed. So we give ourselves credit for what? The beginning inventory plus the items that were started and completed. That's 135,000. And since they tell us they're 100% complete as to materials, we pick up 100% of that, don't we? Okay. How could they possibly be 100% complete as to materials and only 55% is complete as to labor? Is that possible? It's possible because maybe all the materials are put in at the very beginning of the process, right? And then we start to apply the labor, whatever. Okay? So we get that 100%, and then what? Then we go ahead and for our ending work in process, we are again 100% done as to our materials. So they must put the materials in at the beginning of the period. So again, 100%, the beginning of the process. So 30,000 for that. So now we have our what? We have our equivalent units, which are basically all the units, and we take that and we divide that into what? Into our cost, both those in the beginning inventory and those added for the period, and that gives me my cost per equivalent units for the material, right? So the trick there was to pick up that 100%. Okay. Now you come over and you take a look at this one, and it's the same fact pattern, but now they're telling me that what? Well, it's the same fact pattern, but now they're asking me for the conversion cost, aren't they? Huh? Why does it say the same direct materials again? I thought this was the one for conversion costs this time. That's what I thought. Well, this is direct materials again, but I think I gave you the answer for what? For the conversion cost? Or is this a different problem? Okay. Yeah, this is a different problem. Sorry, guys. So this is now what? 65,000 units of product. The production department has a process operation system completed and transferred to finished goods 65,000 units of product. At the end of March, there was a 15,000 additional units were in process in the production department and were 80% complete as to materials. So this is a different problem. I thought it was the same problem where we just asked me about the conversion cost now, but we were what? We completed those units, those 65,000 units. They told me were transferred, so I just picked that up. This is the easy version. I take the 15,000 that are 80% done. I multiply that. That gives me what? My equivalent units. I pick up what? All the costs for the period, and that gives me then my cost per equivalent unit. So that's actually one of the easy ones. I thought that I had put one in there where they had asked me for the what the answer would be if we were dealing with the conversion cost there, but that's materials again, in which they're only 80% done with the materials for the items that are still in progress at the end of the period. Okay, any question on that? Any question on any of those? Okay. If there's no question, then what I would recommend is you go back through the actual quiz now and take another look back through that and work through some of those additional ones that we didn't include in the slides. Make sure you're comfortable with all those, and what we'll do is when we reconvene on Wednesday, we'll entertain any questions about the remainder of the quiz questions, maybe do a couple of them, and then we'll go ahead and jump ourselves. We're going to be in Chapter 4 now. Okay, so take a look at Canvas. I'm going to have the slides and the quizzes up for Chapter 4. You want to bring that all next time, and also I would bring the quiz for Chapter 3, and I might pick out a couple more of those additional questions for us to go through together. I didn't put all of them in the slides, so we might work a couple more of the additional questions for the quiz. Okay? Okay, guys. Huh? Question? Okay. Okay, guys, that's it. That's all we got. We went through that a little faster than I thought, so we should be good. Hi. What were you reminding me about?
Because the canvas, they can't connect to connect, and it says instructor is not set up yet.
When did you look? It's there now.
Okay.
Yeah, should be there now. Yeah, sure. Thanks.